Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar powered by SPDocket. Our guest presenter today is Spence Harbar. He is widely recognized as one of the world's foremost Office 365 and SharePoint authorities. I am Maya and I'm sure that you will enjoy his session today. The session duration will be around 60 minutes and we will try to answer as many questions we can at the end of the webinar. So stay online, and that's all from me for now. And Spence, the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you very much, Maya. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the SharePoint Topology Conundrum. Before we dive in, just a few words on SPDocket from Acceleratio, obviously the hostess of the webcast. And the tool itself actually plays quite nicely into this topic area in so much as it allows us to, with some changes recently to the product, allows us to validate a lot of the aspects of the talk that we'll go through this afternoon. So if you're not aware of the tool, go ahead and check it out. The URL's there on the slides. You can grab a evaluation easily enough from the website. A little bit about me, some contact details here really if you have follow-up questions and so forth that we're not able to get through in the time we have this afternoon. Email is the best route to get me. My background is kind of quite long-winded in the SharePoint space, been working with the product from the very early days and the Microsoft stack before there was a SharePoint product, working both with the product group in terms of future releases, but also, you know, in terms of reviewing current customer pain points and so forth. So as far as the topic area is concerned, we're going to predominantly focus on the problems that SharePoint has had throughout its history as it's grown over time in terms of building a topology or building the ideal deployment for a set of customer requirements, and then sort of switch gears a little bit and focus on the feature, the recent feature in SharePoint Server 2016 called MinRoll, both in terms of how it's sort of been pitched by the vendor and what the reality of the situation is to us in the field when we're working with on-premises farms. And we'll walk through the features of the feature. There's quite a few ancillary things as well to bear in mind. We've got some demonstration machines as well to have a quick look at things. Unfortunately, you can't go through everything in this space because it involves building a farm, and so, you know, obviously we only have an hour for the session. You can build the farm that I show in an hour, just under an hour. So if we did that, it would be a pretty boring session, watching progress bars and so on. And then we'll also cover some of the more recent changes, or they're actually about 6 months old now, the changes that were introduced in Feature Pack 1, which actually make MinRoll much more applicable to the majority of SharePoint Server customers as opposed to what was originally launched with SharePoint Server 2016 RTM. So hopefully that's the session that you were expecting. Let's now dive into some of the details. So SharePoint topology has always been a complex area of the product, or at least has been, you know, for the last sort of 3 or 4 main releases. Fundamentally, topology is the physical architecture of the farm. In other words, on which servers do particular services run. And from a conceptual point of view, this would actually be relatively straightforward and very simple if the product had one type of service and each service in the product sort of followed a common implementation pattern. In other words, it was built the same way, had the same components and the same configuration elements. Unfortunately, that's not really the reality with SharePoint. Over the years, the product has grown very big and very complicated as new features have been added into it. And so we have very simple services, things like the Manage Metadata service, which are very straightforward in terms of their components. They're just .NET assemblies in effect on the machine. And then the configuration elements, as you probably all are aware, are relatively trivial in terms of the way the service application is configured. And that's sort of, one end of the scale of complexity, a nice simple service. But then you have something like the search service application, which is completely different. It includes some Windows services, many other elements in terms of the implementation that are deployed across different machines within the farm. It has a highly complex configuration subset, which is done both at the service application level, but also now indeed within site collections. And so, we have a very simple service like Manage Metadata, a very complex service like Search, and everything in between those sort of two extremes. And because of that, the topology sort of conundrum exists. It becomes quite an important element of an on-premises deployment of anything over a single server farm, of course. Now, there's also some associated sort of reality here that we need to be aware of when we dive into the ins and outs of SharePoint topology. You may hear in recent times, a lot of marketing fluff about how SharePoint 2016 has been built from the cloud up and all of these kind of things. The reality is very different from that. Of course, Microsoft have taken their experience and their learnings from running SharePoint Online and attempted to backport some of those lessons, if you will, into the on-premises product. And Mineral is a good example of one of those things to a certain degree. But it doesn't change the fundamental truth of what SharePoint is as a product. As I mentioned, it's been around for a very long time. It includes virtually every Microsoft development stack element since around '98, which is when the first sort of pre-releases of the product were available. And other elements of the product came from acquisitions. Search is a good example of that. Manage Metadata, portions of that were via acquisitions. And originally the product was very much designed and focused for small-scale deployment. When SharePoint Server 2001 was released, it was very uncommon for customers to deploy multiple farms, farms with a large number of machines, etc. And is very much, the product was very much focused towards a small-scale or departmental level deployment. It wasn't really until SharePoint 2007 that the product really became viable within the enterprise. And it's also never had an architecture rewrite. It's not like SQL Server where with SQL 2000 the product group basically decided that the old stuff was no longer fit for purpose. We'll throw it away, we'll basically rewrite the engine and make it suitable for a large-scale distributed enterprise deployment. What we do have is a number of changes over time that are sort of added on top of the product, which have made it viable for large-scale deployment. But we still, hit issues, particularly around storage design, high availability, disaster recovery, and topology. And so we still have to deal with some of these consequences as we go through the process of designing farms for customers. And so that's what kind of gives us this topology conundrum, right? We have a wide variety of technical elements which mean topology is difficult or topology is hard. It's hard to get right, as it were. We have different types of service instances. We have different types of service applications. And therefore, it's not possible to basically, deploy a SharePoint farm the way it would look nice on a whiteboard or a Visio diagram, because there's, you know, a lot of devil in the detail. It's also worth bearing in mind at this point that we also have legacy services within the product, so things that don't show up within services on server or managed service applications that are still there and inherent to the correct operation of the product. You know, obviously something like the timer service is a good example of a legacy service, which is fundamental to the health of the farm and the functioning of the farm, but it's not something that can be sort of managed in terms of where it runs, etc. And we also have unmanaged services as well. These are things that aren't really part of SharePoint, but come along with SharePoint. Two examples are the claims to Windows token service and the distributed cache, or the app fabric element of distributed cache. And so SharePoint attempts to build an ability to manage those services within SharePoint, but they're not really pieces of SharePoint. They're other Microsoft technology which has been bundled in with SharePoint to provide particular capabilities. And so these 5 things sort of contribute to make topology increasingly difficult. And so this is the field reality, and this is really from my experience working with predominantly larger customers, but not just large customers. I still work with some farms that are very small, and the elements on this slide really do ring true over the last sort of 5 years or so, really. I mean, this isn't a new area of concern by any stretch of the imagination. The first one is really kind of key takeaway is the idea of best practices here is a complete myth, right? That there are some best practices for SharePoint infrastructure, such as, you know, you would always want to use a SQL alias to configure the farm. But when we start talking about, you know, broader concepts, the idea of best practices is really kind of silly, because, you know, what might be a best practice for customer A could be the complete worst practice for customer B. You know, we can't sort of take a cookie cutter approach to some of these aspects with the products, because we don't know, you know, how the customer might be using the product, what sort of you know, number of users they have, you know, those kind of things. And so that's led to a lot of, you know, pretty weak guidance or architectural models out there that have worked for one customer or worked for a couple of customers, but they are promoted then as best practices. You know, this is a significant pain point, especially for SharePoint practitioners in the IT pro or infrastructure space, is to, you know, quite often be asked to build or design a topology without adequate sort of input information in terms of requirements and so on, because the, you know, the deployment is new, and therefore a lot of things that govern topology are not known at that stage. And we'll come back to that kind of aspect a little bit later when we get to the min-roll information. Virtually all of the health checks that are, well, it says on the slide virtually all, I would say all health checks, certainly all of the ones that I've done, whether it be, you know, third-party independent health checks or whether it be the Microsoft service offering, will include, you know, significant flaws related to topology. The reality is that if a SharePoint deployment is successful in terms of its usage by, you know, end users, you're going to need some flexibility. In other words, the topology that you design and deploy on day one is not necessarily going to be the topology that you're running after the thing's been operational for a year. You know, as you discover how the customer base is using the deployment, you're going to perhaps want to make some changes there. Another thing that's very common is that, you know, architects or the practitioners that are involved tend to make things a little bit more complex than they need to be. You know, doing things like services farms, you know, multi-tenancy, those kind of things, you know, niche or edge case elements of the product capability which are not really suitable for most customers tend to be deployed more often than they need to be. And then we have these unmanaged services, or indeed things that are new with the latest release, which sort of cause more problems operationally because they're poorly understood for a period of time. Distributed cache would be a good example of that, which was introduced in SharePoint 2013. But also think about things like Workflow Manager, Office web applications, things that aren't part of the SharePoint product also play into this to a certain degree. The infrastructure for provided hosted apps is a good example of something that was generally poorly understood by the field, you know, from the release of SharePoint 2013 onwards. Which brings us to these little joke here. We've got the Batman meme thing here with the SharePoint consultant there, or the SharePoint influencer, we should say, at the bottom, saying he has the perfect topology, and Batman gives him a slap, because you know, the reality is that there just isn't any such thing as a perfect topology. Now, I'm sure you've all seen some of these types of diagrams, deliberately sort of stolen these from TechNet, not to necessarily kind of just beat up on Microsoft here, but you know, obviously it wouldn't be appropriate to take actual customer diagrams here, so we can, you know, we can use the Microsoft ones for the purposes of getting sort of making a little joke out of them without fear of reprisal. But I would hazard a guess it's probably quite unlikely that any of you have a farm that looks like this, or you may have a farm that is similar in terms of the way things have been split about, but you know, it's already a lot of servers. And this is one of the biggest sort of non-technical elements, a non-functional requirement that drives topology design in the real world, is in most cases you know, the number of servers that are possible to be deployed. In other words, the financials of the project, which is what, you know, defines more often than not the number of servers you can have, is already set in stone before the SharePoint expert shows up. So the common sort of request to the SharePoint architect is, hey, you know, these are our requirements, please design us a farm, but by the way, we've only got 5 servers, and the architect has to kind of cobble together something that kind of works within those restrictions. So this is already looking kind of unlikely as a deployment model. This is a lot more pragmatic, and this is quite commonly deployed model with SharePoint 2013, SharePoint 2016, and to a certain extent is really the initial design model for the min-roll feature. We might, depending on how we do for time, we might come back to this in a bit more detail, but we can see here already, you know, we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, you know, there's at least 10 machines here before we've started, before we consider SQL Server, before we consider Active Directory, Workflow Manager, Office web apps, and so on. And, you know, at the top there, the distributed cache request management one is, you know, something that is very controversial, and often, you know, that one is collapsed with the front end. But this is a more practical deployment model. But of course, if you're working with smaller customers, you know, even this type of model is going to be very cost prohibitive, especially when you factor in disaster recovery or high availability here, you know, effectively doubling up the number of machines that are needed. And then we get these things that are completely ridiculous, right? It says here it's an example enterprise scale farm. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read any of the text here. I can't read it on my screen either. Make it a little bit bigger, then that's just kind of half the diagram. But, if we're going to get to a point where we're deploying at this type of scale, obviously we've got the quite frightening cost implications of this, but we also need to be concerned, how on earth are we going to keep this running? How many SharePoint operators are we going to hire, etc., etc. This is just frankly ridiculous, and there's very few deployments that look like this. There are some, but those that do exist, they tend to be extremely troublesome, and it tends to be the case that you'll actually get much better performance and throughput in very, very high volume farms by not doing this. And without going into details that I can't share, the SharePoint Online farms don't look like this, okay? Because it's not the way to scale both to a horizontal fashion appropriately with this product. The search elements, which is kind of the bottom half, the screen element here that's labeled with a 2, search is something where you do tend to use these types of topologies, but as far as the overall farm is concerned, it's generally not fit for purpose. So again, this is really here just to kind of reiterate the point that what looks good on a Visio diagram or on a whiteboard, is very different from what is sensible to attempt to deploy with the product. And that's what I've just said, repeated on the slide. So hopefully some of these points are sort of ringing true with some of you. You've been in that situation where you've been asked to design something with false constraints or practical constraints, and then butted up against the complexity of the product. And that's where the MinRoll feature is intended to try and address some of these pain points and provide the idea of a unit of scale deployment for the product. And so this is the paraphrasing of the Microsoft kind of pitch for MinRoll in three key areas. The first one is to simplify deployment. From a technical perspective, when you're working with the machines in a farm, you no longer need to worry, for the most part, about which services run on which machines. The product will deal with that for you behind the scenes, and that's the main sort of intent of the features, is to deal with the provisioning of service instances. Then we have improved performance and reliability. The idea is that certain services are optimized to work best within a MinRoll topology, which therefore reduces a number of hops over the network to different machines, and also means that the activities that take place quicker and more reliably. Now, at this point, this is just the pitch, right? It's not necessarily the perfect description of the MinRoll feature. And then down the bottom we have the idea of simpler capacity management and make farm scalability easier. And this one's quite interesting because the feature, as I mentioned, promotes the idea of a unit of scale deployment, something that we've wanted in the product for a long time. There's been a lot of pressure inside the product group over the last 10 years to move towards this type of approach. And now with MinRoll, we have it for the most part. But then the second bullet there around leveraging better capacity planning guidance, is really sort of marketing run amok there, because the reality is if we wanted to leverage capacity planning guidance, there would have to be some capacity planning guidance to leverage. And you know, we're a long time now, it's almost a year since, well, something like that, yeah, it's about 10 months since this kind of text was first made its way out into the open, and you know, that capacity planning guidance doesn't really exist. And so let's compare and contrast that to the reality. Really what we have within MinRole is basically guidance from previous releases, what you might have seen referred to as streamlined topology guidance, and that's been basically codified, it's been implemented inside the product. And so we have the concept of roles which we can deploy, and then service instance provisioning is taken care of for us for the most part for virtually all services. We also have some additional management APIs to help us work with this. So you know, some additional PowerShell commandlets, some additional APIs within the SharePoint server-side object model, and of course central admin changes as well. Now we also have alongside MinRole some changes to other elements of the product in respect to the topology service itself, where that runs, and how timer jobs are initiated. And these are the changes that basically make the second bullet on this slide, on the previous slide, a reality. So the changes are to other things, not just in MinRole, which mean that we have better farm performance and reliability. And with respect to the last point on the previous slide in terms of the idea of farm scalability, because we have a unit of scale deployment model now, it does make the ability to change the farm's topology over the lifetime of the farm much easier. And that's a kind of key area of the service instance provisioning capabilities. So it doesn't really help with scalability per se, but it helps with flexibility, which a lot of people would consider to be the same thing anyway. So as I mentioned, we had this guidance previously called streamlined topologies, which is kind of like the second topology slide that I showed you when we were looking at the Visio diagrams. And basically we have an implementation inside the product that basically encourages you to go down this idea of following streamlined topologies. And that's actually a big improvement to the way the product is generally deployed. In fact, what I'll do just very quickly, we're okay for time. Oh, we have it on the next slides anyway, so I can just go on to that. We then have the idea of the concept of auto provision, which basically is a configuration for each service instance, and if that's set to be true, you know, the system is going to take care of starting and stopping service instances when we create service applications or delete them. We also have some health rule, just one health rule that you know, basically runs to check whether the farm is in compliance. We have some additional UI and some additional PowerShell. So this is the roles that we have within MinRole as per the SharePoint 2016 RTM release. So we have additional roles which I'll come on to later in the slide in feature pack 1. But the idea is that we have these kind of 4 dedicated roles on the left here. The first one being application. So this is really things that serve back-end requests, and what that means is requests that don't influence directly you know, the time for the page to load for the end user. So they have a degree of separation, if you will, from the end user using the SharePoint environment. So this would be a search crawl request, for example, or The best example of one of these things are two elements of the product that no longer exist in 2016, Excel calculation services and user profile sync. Those no longer exist. But if you think about a farm which runs a dedicated crawl front end, in other words, you have the search system crawling a machine that's not the front end that end users use, that would be a good example of the application role within a farm. Then we have this distributed cache tier. The idea here is that the distributed cache works best and the rest of the farm works best is if distributed cache is dedicated. A front end, which is where our service application instances for the most part live, so things like manage metadata, user profile, business connectivity services, things that have, are directly related to end user requests. And then, of course, the web application service that's responsible for serving content. And then the search role is dedicated for things like search, crawl, content processing, etc. So these are the units of scale with the RTM release. And we also have some special roles. I don't want to spend too long on these. Single server farm, fairly obvious. That's where if you've got one machine in the farm, then everything runs on one box. Custom is non-min role. Basically, it's how the SharePoint 2013 product behaved. So we don't have auto provision, etc. And so this role exists so that we can mix and match min role roles and non-min role servers within the same farm, and we might need custom if we need to deploy something that doesn't understand min role. So for example, reporting services, or if we've got some third-party service application that hasn't been updated. So these are the roles that we have available to us. But you can see at this point in time, if we want high availability within our farm, we need a minimum at this stage of 8 servers on top of SQL Server, etc. So this was the initial release RTM, and that was the kind of the problem for most customers is 8 is a bit more than they're willing to provision. So how's this implemented? This shows the PowerShell and configuration wizard approaches to at the top there creating a farm. So when we first add the first machine into the farm, we'll call new SP configuration database. And you can see we have an extra parameter there called local server role, and we have an enumeration of those different roles that we saw on the previous screen. And yes, I have no idea what invalid is. It's still there. It's a lot easier to introduce a bug than it is to remove it, especially from an API contract. Now then, underneath we have the Connect SP configuration database. So this would be, adding a machine into an existing farm. And again, we have the local server role parameter there. Also note that in this example, I'm doing skip registered distributed cache host. I'd recommend you do this because what is going to happen when we run either of these commandlets is it's going to do exactly the same thing that it did in SharePoint 2013. It's going to add the machine into the farm, and it's going to have the default services running. So, SharePoint Foundation Web Application Service, Workflow Timer, incoming email. And then after it's done that, it's going to go ahead and revisit the service instances based on the server role. So it doesn't replace how it used to work, it adds to how it used to work. And so we want to avoid any problems with distributed cache, and we also want to reduce the time it takes overall. So a kind of pseudo best practice, even though I said there aren't any, is to always use that skip register as distributed cache host there. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the demonstration machines. I'm going to attempt to switch over to another screen. There we go. And I'm hoping that you're able to see this SharePoint server. So this farm is a, how many machines have we got here? 9 server machine farm, sorry, 9 server machines. So we've got 2 of each role within the farm, and then we have 1 of custom. We have 1 machine, the box number 9, which is a role custom. And this is the state of the farm after we've done the PowerShell commandlets that I just showed you on the previous slide. And so you can see here what's running on the individual machines. So for distributed cache, we have distributed cache and SharePoint Foundation Web App. Front end, we have the Web App Central Admin. Application, we have the Web App Workflow Timer and Incoming Email. Search has the search prerequisite services, but none of the additional configuration. And then custom is just the same as application at this stage. Now, it's worth noting that this is the RTM build of SharePoint 2016. So there are some changes that were made in response to customer feedback with Feature Pack 1. So, for example, there is no point having the web application on this distributed cache tier, because it's not dedicated. It's kind of pointless. And there's a few things like that that have been cleaned up with the later release. But the real point of this brief demonstration is just to show you the initial state. Also, it's worth pointing out that we have some side benefits with this unit of scale deployment. So I'm just going to flip to the PowerShell script that was used to build this farm. And we have, basic, simple script here, basically exactly the same sort of thing that we saw within the slide to create the first machine in the farm here. And once the farm is created, because we're now using MinRoll, I can actually do a fix-up here to fix the distributed cache service account. Now, we can't do this in SharePoint 2013 because in order to change the identity that it runs as, which is the farm account, it has to already be running. With using MinRoll, we can actually go ahead and do this before we have distributed cache running anywhere in the farm. So that's actually a really nice side benefit of using MinRoll. Then I also do a little bit of changes to the auto provision. So in my farm, I have no need for the Claims to Windows token service. So I can basically go ahead and configure the auto provision by doing stop SP service for that service instance. And yes, unfortunately, it is a string here. Too late. We can't change that. We just have to deal with it. So again, that's something else that cleans up my topology before I've added any machines into the farm. I've got 1 machine in at the moment. And then for the rest of the machines, very simple. I can basically loop through a hash table of servers, which I'll show you in a second. And then I'm going to invoke another script which basically adds the machine to the farm with the role from my hash table. So the hash table is very straightforward. If I can find it. Here we go, farm servers. I basically just have a hash table of servers in the server name and then the role that I want them to run. And so, I can vastly simplify my deployment scripts, make them a lot more straightforward, easier to follow. And the other thing that we won't see in this script is, I do a bunch of things with distributed cache and central admin. Then I create some web apps and site collections, but in nowhere in this script am I starting service instances. Okay, so I'll come on here and I'll create some service applications, but there's no code in here that says, hey, get me the service instance on box 4 and start it, or get me a different service instance on box 8 and stop it, which is traditionally what, you know, automation tooling such as AutoSP installer or even the SharePoint DSC modules deal with that type of work. When we're using MinRoll, we don't need to do it, we just create the service applications. So what I'm going to do just briefly now is go to a different snapshot and sort of to get ready for a later demonstration. So just bear with me a second whilst I kick that off, and I'm going to also attempt to go back to the slides. Okay, so we saw that the farm after the initial machine, the machines have been joined to the farm, but before service applications were created. And what we'll do is go back later to see the result of using MinRoll to do, you know, run the rest of the script effectively and complete the farm build with the feature pack 1 changes. What I didn't show you on the demo, because I've got screenshots of them here, is basically some of the PowerShell commandlets that we can also work with that mirror the central administration UI to a certain degree. So in SharePoint 2013 we have get SP service instance, and the service instance is specific to a service type and a machine within the farm. With SP service, it's farm wide. Okay, so we can see here we have a list of services, we have their auto provision setting and whether currently it's compliant with MinRoll. Now the auto provision is interesting because that Boolean will be flipped depending on the state of the farm. So, you know, if we look at, let's see, where are we, manage metadata web service, that's false when the when machines have been joined to the farm. But once we create the manage metadata service application, auto provision will be flipped to true, and therefore the tooling will start that service instance on the correct machines in the farm. But we do need to be a little bit careful because this isn't a complete list. You know, if we do the old-fashioned way, as it were, we get the farm and then enumerate the services, you can see we have a lot more services. And we've got some things in here, you know, that are either unmanaged services or legacy services that we spoke about earlier, you know, things like the foundation diagnostics, Lotus Notes connector, etc. But, you know, there's obviously two different versions of the truth here, as it were. Okay, so this is the auto provision within central administration. It's basically, you know, the same as running the commandlets at the bottom of the screen here, stop and start SP service. Very straightforward. If we enable auto provision, it's going to start the service. If we disable it, it will stop it. And this will be then, you know, managed when the service application is created. Or in the case of something like claims to Windows, which doesn't have a service a service application, you know, it'll just start and stop. Indeed, in that case, it'll start it on every machine in the farm. But be aware, some services don't support auto provision, so the central administration, for example, you know, it runs on the first machine in the farm, and it's up to us to then start it on other machines if we want there to be more than one. Now, some people complain about that kind of stuff, but, you know, there's only so far this product can go to enforce a model. So, for example, with the claims to Windows token service, we can debate whether that should be in the product or not. That's probably a subject for another session in the future. But if we want to use it, we don't know where it needs to be, because if we were, say, using it with business connectivity services, it has to run on the web server, so the web role. the one that's running the web application service. But if we're using it with a different service application, it might need to run on the application server. So, the product group can't make this sort of crystal ball and know exactly what our deployment's going to be. Same thing with central administration. Some customers like to run that on the application server for security reasons, those kind of things. So they can't guess all the different scenarios. So for some services, it's easier just to leave it up to the deployer. So it doesn't take away all of the complexity. We can also change roles, and this is really, core to this feature in terms of, back to that idea of having a flexible topology. In other words, what you deployed it the way you thought you would need it on day one, but things changed in the company, started using a part of SharePoint more than another, it's more heavily search or it's more heavily BI, so you needed to change the topology to accommodate that. Or it could be something like, the company gets acquired by somebody else, different user population and so on. So we have this glorious screen in Central Admin, which is fantastic because there's no modern user interface with any silly text or fonts or colors. It's just good old-fashioned combo box in HTML here, and this allows us to change the role of a server. And when we do this, the system is going to go ahead and take care of provisioning the appropriate services, so stopping things that no longer need to be running and starting ones that do. Now, there is a gotcha with this with respect to what I'm showing in the screenshot. As I'm changing a distributed cache machine to a front end, we will need to do some fix-up for distributed cache manually after it. Again, distributed cache is effectively not part of SharePoint really, it's a separate service, and there's some things that the system can't handle for us. Now, the topology service changes, in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip over this briefly, but this is the reason why a SharePoint 2016 farm with exactly the same hardware will be faster than a SharePoint 2013 farm in normal usage situation. We no longer deploy the topology service everywhere, and we have this concept of preferring local. So if we have, if we're in the web app process and we need to speak to managed metadata, and managed metadata is running on that machine, which it will be in a min-role topology, we're going to go direct to that process on the same machine. Whereas in the previous version, we'd go like round robin to more often than not another machine across the network, which doesn't make sense. And this indeed is a feature that the benefit of doing this was discovered in SharePoint Online, and so the choice was made to effectively backport that into the on-premises product. There's a link on the slides there that takes you to a post that goes into more details on this. But this isn't really anything to do with min-role, it's another change in the topology service that helps. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to, or I'm going to attempt to switch back to the VMs, and let's see how we go on here. Now, we might need to wait a few moments for this to load up. Yeah, unfortunately, I should have been doing that whilst I was talking. Apologies. Just be a few moments for this to start up. But as I mentioned, earlier, it's basically the same environment, but we have now gone through and run the rest of the script, and you can see here that this is creating all the service applications. So sub-settings, app management, metadata, BDC, etc. Basically, I think this script does everything. Yeah, it does everything. But there's no code in here, there's no script in here that is starting the managed metadata service instance. There's no code that's worrying about which machines it's on and so on and so forth, because we don't need to worry about that. We've just deleted all that stuff from the scripts because we're no longer needed. And so this is the end result of this topology now. We have distributed cache is truly dedicated, okay, so there's only the distributed cache service instance running on those machines. We have the front, oops, that's weird. The front end machines run obviously the foundation web application, and then all of the low latency, the low latency service applications that are related to end user requests. And this is a big sort of, I suppose it's quite common now, but a lot of time in the past people would deploy things like BDC and MMS on an app server. Well, they always should have been on the front end server. So this model promotes that. You can see, what we have there: user profile, Visio, secure store, etc. I also have central admin on those machines. That's the way I prefer to do it, but they can be on any machine basically. Then we have our application server, and let me just get out there and scroll down a bit. Let's do it like this actually. And this is quite confusing, because the only real difference here is that we also have those services running there, but we have a few additional ones. So in this case it's incoming email, which doesn't actually do anything by default until we configure it. It's just kind of sat there doing nothing. But then we have things that are, long-running operations or batch in nature. So things like PowerPoint conversion, Word automation. Now, most customers don't use those service applications. So if you're not doing incoming email and you don't care about PowerPoint and Word automation, then the application role kind of seems redundant. But what it is useful for is to, again, run this dedicated crawl front end. Okay, so have search crawl the application server rather than the front end, and separate that crawling traffic from end user traffic, which is a sensible deployment model. Of course, in previous versions of the product, there were other things that would run on here, Excel, Calc, user profile sync, etc., but those have been removed. And then we have search, which again has our prerequisite services here. But the search topology, so the search component topology, is still managed not by MinRole, but by the search service application itself. And I hope, I'm not sure because it's been a very long time since I've actually used this this snapshot. It's taking a long time, that's for sure. I'm pretty sure that this has already been configured, but in this case I'm just going to have all roles on each machine because I've only got 2 search servers. So the reason for showing this is just to reiterate that search topology is not managed by MinRole. We still need to deal with that using PowerShell the same way as before. Now, one other thing to point out is the custom role here, basically down the bottom, so server 9. This guy is just basically the behavior from SharePoint 2013. So these are the default service instances that run. I would then manually go ahead and configure what I want on this machine. And also, this is if we're quick and whilst we're adding a machine to the farm, we hit refresh on this page, we will see the machine come in like this and then change to how it should be as we go through the process of adding the machine to the farm. Also got this compliance column here. So if I, as a server administrator, go ahead and stop a service instance, for example, we'll be out of compliant, and then the system will attempt to correct that automatically if we configure it thus. And then we can also, if I go to the right screen, sorry about that, these machines are quite slow today. Ready for the long weekend that's coming up. We have the the Manage Services in the Farm screen, which we saw on the slides, this is where we can configure or disable or enable the auto provision. So I'm just going to go ahead and enable auto provision here on the Claims to Windows token service, which I previously, deliberately turned that off. And you can see that it now says that it's processing, and we're not currently compliant because it's in the middle of basically starting that service instance. Refresh that. Now, if we come back onto our servers in Farm, we should be able to see it's not kicked in yet. Here we go. It's done it already. It's complete. So Claims to Windows token service, Claims to Windows token service, Claims to Windows token service, and so on. So it's running on the application and web roles. This is the feature pack 1. So we no longer need it in the RTM. It would run on search and distributed cache as well, which we don't want. Also, we have the convert server role in the Farm. So we've seen this screen, but the reason for showing this is to demonstrate the collapsed roles. So in this Farm at the moment, I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Okay, but that's even if I got rid of custom and I had 1 of each, it's still 4. It's still quite a lot. So what a lot of customers have asked for is these idea of combined roles or collapsed roles. So we can now have front end with distributed cache, which is aggregate of the roles from both, and then application with search. I'm not going to pick one of these just because we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to get through the rest of the slides. But these collapsed roles allow basically MinRole to become appropriate for all SharePoint server customers rather than just the people with money for 8 server farms. So what I will do though is attempt to change this guy to be a front end, and it's not going to finish on time, I would imagine, but it's basically going to go ahead and work through the process of correcting the service instance configuration on this farm and slow everything down for me. Let me come over here. And still doing it. What we should see here now is that whilst this is happening, you can see it's starting to start up some of the other service instances. It's not compliant, and it's just going to go through the process of getting it ready, starting them one after the other. You can see it's done a bunch now, but it's not quite finished. The timer job also is worth mentioning. This runs by default once a day, and by default it will attempt to fix the configuration if it finds that it's out of compliance. So it has the auto fix or auto heal configured. But what I generally would recommend is that that auto fix is not really is disabled basically. It's unlikely that a server administrator is going to make a change without there being a reason for it, and you would hope that there's appropriate sort of farm documentation and so on in place to prevent that. But you need to be a little bit cautious and test whether you want the system to go ahead and change topology for you on the fly. You see that says it's completed successfully. Never really sure whether I believe it when SharePoint tells me that, but in this case we can be pretty confident. You can see this guy is now a front end. It's got the appropriate services. Now, of course, if we were hosting web applications on this machine, which of course we would be because it's a front end, we'd still have to go and deal with, SSL certificates in IIS. The things that SharePoint can't manage, we still need to deal with out with this system. Okay, going to flip back to the slides. Running out of time here. Hopefully get through these quite quickly and then we can do some Q&A. Yeah, so some changes in feature pack 1. I mean, we've seen some of them in the demonstration. The key thing really is that it introduces these shared roles, or what I called collapsed roles. So we can now have, you know, a highly available SharePoint farm with MinRole with 4 machines. It makes MinRole appropriate for every SharePoint server customer, and there really isn't a good reason not to use MinRole. The other thing to bear in mind is that we can combine, you know, you're not choosing shared roles or dedicated roles, you can mix and match them. So that gives us the ultimate in terms of flexibility without really losing any scale deployment stuff. So these are the shared roles. We saw this in the combo box. They're basically, you know, the combination of the roles from each of the 2. And that allows us to do these kind of topologies. So, you know, obviously single server farm, we can have a small farm that's MinRole without high availability, it's just 2 boxes, or if we want high availability, then the minimum is 4. And that, you know, that 4-1 is a very popular deployment model with customers. But then we can do more interesting things like this by combining the 2, you know, the shared roles and the dedicated roles. So in this case, we have the 6 server, which, you know, for your average farm, this is probably a good start point, you know, for SharePoint 2016. And this one is, you know, optimized for search. So we have front-end and distributed cache, we have app and search. But we could also do it, but have it just optimized for end usage throughput. So say we were doing heavy social, SharePoint social. Hopefully not, but if we were, you know, this would be the appropriate topology for that. And then of course we can go bigger with dedicated roles as per the previous release. I showed you the shared roles conversion in the earlier demo, so we'll just skip over that. These really are for reference, and there's actually still a mistake on this slide which has been fixed. Obviously in a search farm, search is required. This TechNet diagram has been fixed since I did the grab here. But this is just if you are doing more than one farm, you know, content services farm type deployment or search farm deployment, what the requirements are, really for reference after the session. And then this is again reference, a bit like the PowerShell that I showed you where you listed all the services. This shows you, you know, which services run on which role across the board for reference. And then, you know, this doesn't include the hidden services. Also worth mentioning SP.kit at this point. So SP.kit is, as hopefully you know, one of the things it does is produce documentation for a farm, which is, you know, totally awesome because the vast majority of SharePoint customers have no documentation for their farm, or if they do, it's, you know, so out of date and incorrect that it's worthless. But anyway, on the left-hand side, you can see, you know, a topology diagram. And what the guys have done over at Acceleratio is obviously update SP.kit so that it understands the MinRole capability, so it will include it in here, and also in terms of the best practices analyzer and the other reports that DocKit produces, allows you to validate against the MinRole topology guidance, or sorry, the MinRole topology model within the product. So a nice way to diagram out your farms. Obviously this is a simple example, but could be more complex than this. So to wrap up, a few minutes over, apologies for that. The key benefits of MinRole is around not having to worry about where service instances are deployed. We don't even care really, for the most part, about stopping and starting them. I mean, there's a few exceptions, you know, the outliers, things that you can imagine in the future may no longer be part of the product, you know, where we have to do a little bit of manual tidy up. But you saw my deployment script, it's a lot simpler. You can reduce the farm deployment scripting by easily 500 lines of PowerShell. Anytime you can reduce a script or simplify it, it's good because it reduces the likelihood of mistakes. It also makes it easier to build a modular automation solution. Automating SharePoint is still kind of weak because of the management APIs. So even if we're using something like DSC, it's not all a bed of roses. And so by having features like this allows us to be more modular in the way we approach deployment automation. We have these small changes to the topology service, which is a big benefit to overall farm performance. And finally, we have in this product, which has always been quite complex in terms of logical decomposition, a unit scale deployment model. And we'll see that embraced in the future as new releases come, whether that be future feature packs or future major releases of the product, where services become more aware of the feature. One other thing that wasn't in, I'm sorry, going the wrong way, I haven't mentioned is that the overall sort of deployment model for custom service applications, if you've got those, it's quite easy to build in support for MinRoll. So some drawbacks. Well, the key one is that originally, when we had the 4 roles and they were dedicated, is to ask yourself, is a pseudo SharePoint online topology appropriate for on-premises deployments? Well, the answer to that is no. In most cases, because you have, in order to take advantage of it, you have to change your approach to deployment, which is something most customers are not willing to do. SharePoint Online doesn't actually use MinRoll because there are dedicated search farms in SharePoint Online. So that's not something for most on-premises customers is going to be appropriate. So it's a lot more viable now. We have Feature Pack 1 with the shared roles allows us to do this without having to spend a lot of money on servers. So you can see the kind of number breakdown there before Feature Pack 1. There are a few deployment gotchas. We covered some of those in the presentation this afternoon. Basically not all services are understood by MinRoll at present. That will change over time, but in the meantime, we need to think about those things. And, the other thing is, it's all very well to say, oh, it's great, it means your deployment scripts are better. But at the same time, there's an associated con to that, which is that you have to change your deployment scripts, to take advantage of it. Indeed, one of the things that I've done with my kind of hacked together scripts is where I had that hash table of server roles, I've actually created a bunch of SharePoint 2013 routines that do what MinRoll does. And so now, whether it's a 2013 farm or a 2016 farm, I use the same script, I use the same model, but I'm kind of approximating MinRoll in the way that these service instances are provisioned. But yeah, change obviously requires people to actually do some work, so that might be considered a drawback. Oh, and that's interesting. I thought I had a final slide, but it's gone. It's just a black screen. Interesting. Well, that's it for the presentation. I hope it's been useful to you. I'm certainly happy to hang around and do some Q&A.
Okay. Great, Spence. It was a great presentation. Thank you very much. We have 2 questions here from Thomas. I can read them to you.
Okay.
So first question, since SharePoint is transactional, we were recommended to use Hyper-V rather than VMware. Interested in knowing your input, and Thomas says that they use a product line architecture from Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean the choice of virtualization host is one of these kind of Apple v PC type debates. I mean, there really isn't a clear differentiation in terms of transactional throughput, IOPS, performance, anything like that between ESX and Hyper-V. There's pros and cons to both products. certainly would have no no reason not to use either of them. Generally, the choice is less about technical stuff. It's more, if the organization's already got a significant investment in VMware, then they're going to use, vSphere or ESX. If they've already got an infrastructure, on the Microsoft stack, they're more likely to go with Hyper-V. It's really more about those kind of things, and then obviously the skills, in-house skills in terms of running Hyper-V versus running ESX, those kind of things. There really isn't you can't legitimately or with any credibility say that one is better than the other in terms of performance, for running a production system. There really is, every so often one will leapfrog the other, but for the most part those things are all on par, especially with a product like SharePoint, which, if you remember the slide about sort of the fundamental reality of the product, SharePoint has not been designed to work well in a virtual environment, so that's why we don't like dynamic memory, we don't like resource over allocation, etc. And so for a product like that doesn't really take advantage of all the things it could do in a virtualized deployment, it's really 50-50 between the two, and it's more a question of, what the customer's most comfortable using, either commercially or in terms of how they run that environment. Naturally Microsoft are going to be pushing Hyper-V, and a lot of the Microsoft guidance is for Hyper-V. That makes sense, right? It's their product. They're not going to detail how to do things with a competitor's product. And likewise, Azure infrastructure as a service VMs effectively are using the same core infrastructure technology there. So you could argue that Hyper-V is a better place to be because you're closer to potentially a cloud-hosted future, etc. But as far as performance and throughput and things like that are concerned, the sorts of things that will kill you in a virtual environment is your storage. So it's really 50-50 between the two. PLA deployment, it doesn't really influence that aspect. I know quite a lot about the PLA. It does, to a certain extent, already enforce the streamlined topology deployment model, but it's just effectively, it's a architecture deployment that closely resembles SharePoint Online from a topology perspective. It doesn't really influence the choice of virtual platform.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Also, Thomas says, Nintex always recommends running SharePoint Foundation workflow timer service in front-end machine, and I see you're running it on application server, so which one is correct?
Yeah, again, it doesn't, this is one of these outlier services where it's actually not that important where it runs. I wouldn't be, I would be totally comfortable running it on both web and application, but in a min-role topology that would be out of compliance, and it would specify that it needs to run on the application server. I've seen the guidance from Nintex previously. In theory, what's going on there is, the user's initiating the workflow, therefore you want it on that machine, but the reality is it really going to make any significant difference to anything? Not really, because the workflow is an out-of-band operation anyway. I wouldn't be overly concerned with it running on the application server.
Okay, thanks. So Frank and Sandy said that this was an excellent webinar and that everything was very useful, and I really agree with them. So thank you one more time, Spence. This was really a great session.
Great. I hope it was useful. Thanks for sort of spending an hour of your afternoon listening to me walk along, and hope it was useful.
Yeah, okay, so thank you everyone for coming. We really had a big audience today, which really makes me happy. I hope that you will join us next time, and everyone have a nice day. Bye. Bye, Spence.
Cheers. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Bye.